Thanks for joining us, everybody. Also this week, the convention bump. Presidential candidates usually get a boost in their polling numbers after the national conventions. The Democrats have finished their businesses. Republicans will go this week. And both candidates would really like to see a boost from voters other than ones in their core group. And by proxy, so would the other candidates on the ballot in Texas. Before this week's convention, the Texas Hispanic Policy Foundation did some polling. Mr. Trump leading all likely Texas voters by about 5 points. But look at this. Likely Hispanic voters favoring Mr. Biden by nearly 10, but Hispanic folks with a four-year college degree favor the president by nearly 10 points. And similar results for second-generation Hispanics and Hispanic families who only speak English in their homes. Another group to watch going forward, women in suburban areas. So you see that Democrats are working to make this election about the character of the presidential candidates to try and reach them. It's likely part of Mr. Biden's vice presidential choice of Senator Kamala Harris as well. And on this 100th anniversary of women earning the right to vote, Ms. Harris represents another step forward, regardless of what you think about her politics. Our Candace Sweat spoke to some Texans who know the candidate personally.
When Carla Braley became vice chair for the Texas Democratic Party in 2018, she never anticipated this moment.
I can honestly say I did not see this coming.
But the more she thought about it, she says the more it made sense. Like Harris, Braley is also a graduate of Howard University, one of more than 100 historically black colleges and universities in the U.S.
Howard did a very, very good job of having us to embrace that character of truth and service. I think it impacts even in terms of data, how we'll be able to start looking at the impact that HBCUs are having even in the workforce.
While Harris's nomination is historical, there are skeptics. While serving as Attorney General in California, some claim she didn't do enough to support social reform.
She did not turn out to be, from our perspective, the progressive prosecutor that she promised to be when many of us supported her.
Those who know Harris have come to her defense.
When I decided to go work for Kamala, I knew that she, like me, envisioned a day where fairness is truly fair and this thing called justice is truly just, and that justice can in fact be blind.
Braley says this moment is about more than politics.
But now it's happening, and I have a little black girl who can grow up and believe that she can be anything, any person she wants to be.
All right, that is Candace Sweat in Dallas. John Gibson is the Democratic candidate for Texas House District 84. Good to see you again.
Good to be here.
What's your feeling now about the ticket and the state and national virtual conventions that are now over as a sort of second launching point for a campaign? Do those things help you at all?
Oh yeah, it helps me a lot. The convention was great. You had, in years past, you had a convention that was really pretty boring because you have all this parliamentary stuff.
Right.
And this convention, having the virtual convention that they had, you had candidates who were giving all these speeches, and they were able to talk directly to the voter. They're talking to the people on TV instead of talking to the crowd. Instead of speeches to the convention crowd, they were giving speeches to the actual voters. And so there's a lot of excitement out there. The people that were watching those speeches are getting energized and getting enthused. And so I think it was actually a much better convention than any convention we've ever had.
Well, let's talk about the enthusiasm. You've been part of some voter registration work that's being done here. Who's registering? I mean, it seems like it would be just young people, but is that the case?
I think that's primarily the case.
Yeah.
Young people who haven't voted before. It's one of these things where I really hate the fact that we have one political party, the party that I'm not a part of, that seems to not want to have people vote. And so you've got a lot of Democratic activists that are out there getting people registered to vote, because it's important that everybody makes their voice heard. I don't understand this idea that we want to limit people's opportunity, limit people's right to vote. It just doesn't make sense in the American democratic system. But as Trump would say, it is what it is.
Yeah. Oh, so let's talk about the campaign and a few of the issues that have sort of taken over a lot of the state chatter here. Should state lawmakers be in Austin right now in a session sort of checking the governor's decision making on the COVID response, as some have suggested here?
I think that when we first knew about the outbreak and we first knew that it was going to be very important for the state of Texas to take some action on this, I think the governor should have called a special session. Now, unlike Senator Perry, I don't think a special session should be called because our liberties are being infringed. I think that a special session should have been called so that we could have committee hearings to determine what are the appropriate steps that we need to do to safeguard our kids, to safeguard teachers, to safeguard things financially, so that as we've now learned, the governor is using his powers to dole out money to special interest groups and to people that are favorable to him. We needed to have those watchdogs, those safeguards in place to prevent those kinds of things from happening.
I know you've been an advocate for Medicaid expansion.
Yes.
Is this a good time for that? Is there a way to get that back on the table as we move toward all this now?
Yeah, absolutely. If we expanded Medicaid, 1 million more Texans would be insured at no additional cost to Texans.
And Texans losing their jobs, and insurance sometimes goes along with that.
Exactly, exactly. And so we definitely need to have Medicaid expansion.
Obviously, everyone's sort of been COVID-centric here over the past few months.
Sure.
But we've talked a lot about civil rights here on this show and others, and the treatment of others by police in some parts of the country. What can state lawmakers do in Texas to facilitate that continuing here and keeping that conversation going?
Oh, well, first off, I've been told it takes on average 6 years to get legislation passed in Texas. That's how slowly our state legislature works. So we have things like, for instance, the officer in Tulia that was getting people convicted of drug crimes based solely on his testimony alone. We have the Sandra Bland Act that it got watered down and never got a fully, a really true Sandra Bland Act passed. These things happen. In other words, the slowdown happens because we don't keep the pressure on our legislators to get things done, because the legislature only meets once every 2 years. So yeah, we've got to keep the pressure on our legislature. I certainly support those kinds of things. I also support things such as when it comes to traffic stops, we should not have the police able to arrest someone for just a routine traffic stop without some type of compelling evidence for that arrest to take place. Those kinds of things, for instance, the traffic stop thing, would have prevented Sandra Bland from ever being arrested in the first place.
Right.
But we've got to have people putting pressure on their legislature to get that done, and we've got to elect politicians that'll get it done.
Final seconds we've got here. I know
Yeah.
you, like a lot of folks, have been doing a lot on social media. You've been doing a lot of discussions on various topics with groups of people. Is that going to continue here up until the election?
Oh, certainly. Yeah. In fact, it'll continue after the election. When I'm elected state representative, one of the things that I've told people is you can expect me to periodically throughout the day keep you informed of what I am doing during the day, so that way you know that your tax dollars are going to support a state representative that's working on your behalf and isn't out going and partying late nights at high dollar meals paid for by lobbyists and that kind of thing.
A little pre-transparency maybe for John Gibson.
That's right.
Candidate in District 84. Good to see you again. Good
Good
luck
to be
you.
here. Thanks for having me.
And coming up, the string of visits to Lubbock from elected dignitaries continues with Senator
You're watching Talking Points, a focus on the political scene in Lubbock and across the South Plains.
And welcome back. Here's a look at some of the political headlines of the past week. The governor, lieutenant governor, and House Speaker in Fort Worth this week saying that any city that defunds its police department will have its property tax revenue frozen at its current level and would never be able to increase its taxes again. Directed straight at the city of Austin, and after that, city's council moved $150 million away from its police. The earliest this legislative plan could take place is next September. Senator John Cornyn toured the Texas Tech Health Sciences Center this week for a look at how federal funding to battle coronavirus is working here in Lubbock. The center receiving $6.2 million through the CARES Act. And the senator had some good things to say about how the hospital and the city of Lubbock have handled the crisis. And Texas Ag Commissioner Sid Miller visited the hub city last week, attending an awards ceremony for Congressman Jody Arrington, hosted by the new South Plains chapter of the group U.S. Women in Agriculture, and then visiting with farmers to talk about the possibility of getting licensed to grow hemp here. And with the drought and the virus and everything else, I hear it's starting to sound a little better to some folks. Congressman Arrington publicly announcing some new legislation here this week aimed to protect law enforcement and add penalties to people who riot during otherwise peaceful protests. This after a summer of violence in some of the country's largest cities, and our Grace Morris has more.
Congressman Jody Arrington announced 3 new pieces of legislation targeting rioting and the protection of federal law enforcement.
But they are taking people's livelihoods, and in fact, they're taking people's lives.
The new legislation, he says, would double the maximum imprisonment for rioting and increase penalties for assault against federal officers.
Peaceful protests are a fundamental right that I will fight to protect us. But when criminals and extremists who would commit crimes hijack those, they must be held accountable.
Arrington believes that increasing accountability for rioters would discourage future wrongdoing and wants the federal government to take responsibility to help keep all citizens safe.
I think there's great alarm if we don't put a stop to it. That the federal government has a responsibility in this matter to protect the property, to protect federal personnel, and to protect the rights of law-abiding American citizens.
Angela Underwood Jacobs joined Arrington at the announcement. Jacobs is the sister of Federal Protective Service Officer Patrick Underwood, who Arrington says was killed in the aftermath of protests.
Each individual is accountable for his actions. In this time of crisis, I ask myself, where are our leaders?
And despite national conversations about defunding police, Arrington says government should increase accountability for wrongdoers rather than cut police budgets.
I think it is upside down and asinine. It will endanger not only the citizens, but our law enforcement officers, and it will only encourage more lawlessness.
All right, that is Grace Morris reporting. Time to spend 5 good minutes with Abilene attorney Tom Watson, who's the Democratic candidate hoping to replace Mr. Arrington in Congress this next time around. It's good to see you.
Well, thank you. It's good to come to Lubbock from Abilene, and it was a little hectic trip this morning. I got a late start, so I had to make some phone calls and apologize to people. But
these things happen anymore.
Yep.
Hey, I asked John Gibson this a little bit earlier. I wanted to ask you too. Biden-Harris ticket, state and natural virtual conventions are over. Are those things that help for you in your campaign at all at this point?
Well, I think they're helpful. Now the issue is, how helpful are they? And you get attention. I mean, it draws attention to the political system. So I think that in and of itself is a help.
We just talked on our show about your opponent's bill to increase penalties for folks who riot and loot and things of that nature. A good idea. Your thoughts on the bill as a whole there?
I don't see the point. The protests are alleged mobs that he's talking about. I don't believe existed to the extent that they existed. They were there as a reaction to Donald Trump putting in apparently some type of federal officers who, at least allegedly, were taking people off the street. They were not identifiable as any kind of law enforcement officers. I think that just led to additional protest, which led to violence that didn't exist prior to those officers getting out there doing that.
Let's talk about some ways, kind of bring it back home a little bit, talk about small businesses and families right now and the situations that a lot of folks are in. I know you had talked some about raising the minimum wage once again. Seems like a tough expense if you're a business owner right now. So can that work in this environment that we have right now with COVID and everything?
Well, I think it has to. I think we have to take the long-range view in things like minimum wage, because there's a domino effect to those things. You put them in place, they give people more money to spend, therefore they increase the overall economic growth, which affects all businesses, small and large. Now, how we do this, how we phase it in, and how we apply it to small versus large businesses, those are issues that need to be resolved. I don't think you could come out and say, tomorrow morning minimum wage goes up to $15 an hour. I think it has to be phased in on some type of level. And now, you could certainly do it as far as large businesses and large corporations. You could make it effective, but you could phase it in to the smaller businesses that are locally owned and operated.
The president's talked again about delaying payroll taxes for a few months, which I think sounds good to some folks on paper, but I know that you've said that there's a little more to it than that. It's probably not a good idea as well. Why is that?
Because then the people will not have the money to pay those in the next quarter when they've got to make up the payment that they missed the previous quarter. So I don't see it has any effect. I know in my business, I believe if I explained that to my employees, that they would want take it out as it is supposed to be taken out. Because don't hit me with a bigger lump, bigger sum, 3 months or 6 months from now. So it's not doing any good.
Yeah.
It's just a way to get some attention.
Your opponent talked here last week about how the federal government should probably take a minimal role in helping local school districts deal with the virus and their safety plans that are going into effect right now. Good idea? You agree with that?
Well, the thing about it is, though, at the same time he's talking about that, he's talking about mandating that schools be open. So I think he's speaking out of both sides of his mouth. If we want schools to open, we're going to have to allow them to open on their terms. We can't go in and be dictating how they do it. Every school is different. Every school system is different. I grew up and went to what then was the Class B school, the smallest level in Texas. Those schools, which are now Class A, have to operate differently than a 4A school does, or a 5A or a 6A school. An example is, many of those schools have classrooms that are the same size as the larger schools. Well, they can spread out more. They have smaller number of students in a class. So, they could deal with a lot of issues that are going to be much more difficult for large schools with large enrollments. So the schools need the ability to tailor how they do these things based on their situation. And we can't do one size fits all.
Tom Watson is a Democrat running for District 19, the congressional seat in Texas. Good to see you again. Good luck to you.
Thank you very much.
And coming up, a lot of angry folks watching some changes at the post office right before a lot of us hope to vote by mail. Looks